Hello, I'm Jemimah Smith, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about Greek tragedy. So, what is Greek tragedy? Tragedy is a literary genre dealing with tragic events and the unhappy consequences of human actions, especially concerning a tragic hero. Greek tragedy reached its most significant form in Athens in the 5th century BC. The most acclaimed Greek tragedians are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These tragedians often explored themes surrounding human nature, mainly to connect with the audience, but also as a way of bringing the audience into the play. The basic structure of a Greek tragedy is fairly simple. First, there is the prologue, which is background information spoken by one or more characters. Second, the chorus, who enters and sings the paradas, or opening song, while dancing. The chorus usually consisted of 12 to 50 players. Third, the episode, which is a spoken section where dialogue takes place between actors, like a scene. Usually there'd be no more than 3 actors in a Greek tragedy. And finally, the stasimon, a choral ode sung by the chorus after the actors leave the stage, commenting on or explaining the action of the play so far. According to Aristotle, tragedy evolved from the satire Dinthram, an ancient Greek hymn, which was sung along with dancing in the honour of Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of wine, theatre and fertility, called Bacchus by the Romans. He was a central figure in the evolution of Greek tragedy, and most theatrical festivals were held in his honour. Aristotle explores the nature of Greek tragedy in his treatise, Poetics. He states that the purpose of tragedy is to bring catharsis, a purgation, purification, or cleansing of emotions. He outlines 6 characteristics of the tragedy. First, mimesis. Tragedy is an imitation of human action, causing the audience to reflect on human instinct and desires. Second, complete and serious. Tragedy must be comprehensive and solemn so that it has a significant impact on the audience. Third, magnitude. A tragic hero should possess some status and his actions should have momentous implications. Fourth, artistic language. The language of tragedy should be figurative, metaphorical, and attractive. Fifth, in the form of action. A tragedy should not be a mere narrative, but always in the form of what the actors are doing. And finally, catharsis. The aim of tragedy is ultimately to excite emotion and exploit them in the spectator, so that when they leave the tragedy, A, they reflect upon the consequences of bad actions, and B, they see their own lives in a more positive light. Now, where were tragedies performed? Tragic plays were performed at the state-run festivals for Dionysus, called the Dionysia in spring and the Linnea in winter. These were religious festivals, and thus the atmosphere surrounding the performances were more like that of a religious ceremony than entertainment. There were altars to the gods, priests in attendance, and the subjects of tragedies were often heroes of legend, religious myth, and history. Playwrights would apply to the archon or leader for a chorus. The state then selected the competitors as well as sponsors called the choragus and judges which consisted of 10 citizens. An open-air theatron, literally meaning a place for viewing, brought together as many as 15,000 politicians, philosophers, poets, artists and scientists from ancient Greece's independent city-states, many of which had different views on politics and culture. At the Dionysia, playwrights pitted their work against one another in competition. Each presented a trilogy of tragedies followed by a comic satire play. These festivals, therefore, became an opportunity for Greek playwrights to voice their political opinions and present new ideas in their tragedies. Now, to fully grasp the significance of Greek tragedy, we must explore its context. What was Athens like in the 5th century BC? pride in its democracy. Having been governed by tyranny for over 1,000 years beforehand, in 450 BC, equal rights, a set of new democratic institutions, and voting districts had finally been established by Cleisthenes, a noble Athenian of the time. Now Athens was a democracy, demos meaning people and kratia meaning power. The polis, or city-state, allowed all male Athenians to hold offices, attend the assembly, and contribute to political decisions. Equality, or isonomia, was the moral and practical basis of ruling, and political and private liberty were now both practiced. The assembly, or ecclesia, was the main law-making body. Approximately 30,000 male citizens over the age of 20 had the right to attend, speak, and vote at the assemblies. Athens also had a functional legal system. Each year, around 6,000 citizens served as jurors in the courts. Law courts heard private and public cases. One of the leading councils, the Council of Areopagus, soon became responsible for homicide cases. For the Athenians, guilt and innocence wasn't entirely decided upon evidence or fact, but also how persuasive someone's rhetorical defence or speech was. In 431 to 404 BC, Athens went to war against Sparta in what was known as the Peloponnesian War. Sparta had invaded Athens and caused great internal conflict within the city, undermining the democratic government of Athens and fueling unrest. During the Peloponnesian War, a specifically shocking event occurred which demonstrated the extent of this disruption and violence. This was the siege of Melos. In 416 BC, during a truce with Sparta, Athens sent about 3,400 men to get Melos to join the Delian League or to be destroyed. The siege lasted half a year and Melos finally surrendered. Athens executed countless adult men and sold women and children into slavery. This established a cultural climate of unrest and war. So, how did contemporary politics influence tragedy? For tragedy to shock and evoke emotion in an audience, the plays would have to resonate with the experiences of the people. If the audience felt detached from the play, it would not carry the same significance. In a sense, tragedy was an expression of the establishment, fundamentally different from modern theatre. It did not necessarily voice political dissent, but invited the audience to political reflection. In this way, the Dionysia became a political organ which allowed the audience to reflect on issues and problems relevant to the Athenian polis. The heterogeneity of the festival meant these tragedies could proclaim their messages to people from all over Greece and the surrounding provinces. Tragedies would depict the consequences of tyranny, such as Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, which presents Zeus as the ultimate tyrant. Euripides also wrote a number of tragedies in response to the events of the time. He explores the consequences of war in his play Trojan Women, where he presents the tragic fates of the women after the Trojan War. One particular example of where contemporary politics affected playwrights is Euripides' Hippolytus. In this play, the protagonist, Hippolytus, is cursed by Aphrodite for remaining chaste and not giving in to desire. She makes his stepmother, Phaedra, fall in love with him, and when he finds out this from her nurse, he gives a misogynistic speech condemning women in general. Phaedra takes her own life. However, before she dies, she writes a note accusing Hippolytus of attempting to seduce her. Upon reading this note, Theseus, the father of Hippolytus, orders his son's exile, who eventually dies. This seeming injustice is explored in a scene between Hippolytus and Theseus, where Hippolytus attempts to prove his innocence. He gives a persuasive and dramatic speech, alluring to the style of Athenian trials, and Euripides reflects on the polis by depicting the consequences of injustice. Even specific events, such as the siege of Melos, have been reflected in Greek tragedy. Although modern classicists have begun to reject this notion, it has been widely believed that Euripides based his tragedy Troads on the siege of Melos. Overall, the contemporary politics of Athens at the time had a significant impact on the creation of the Greek tragedy, as playwrights began to reflect upon the climate of war and how important democracy really was. Moreover, using relatable and well-known circumstances meant that tragedies could resonate and evoke emotion in the audience, and the Dionysia soon became central to the politics of Athens. How has tragedy developed and changed? Tragedy finds its origins in Greece, however its influence reaches far beyond the 5th century BC. After the decline of Greek tragedy was not truly revitalised until the Elizabethan era. Elizabethan popular theatre, like Greek tragedy, finds its origins in religious festivals. Initially, biblical stories were the focus of dramatisation. However, soon, drama became a vital part of secular Elizabethan life. What were called tragic scenes became more and more melodramatic, and the rediscovery of Greek and Roman culture in the Renaissance led to a shift towards scepticism and individualism. The bloody play Gorboduc by Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton, first acted in 1561, is now known as the first formal English tragedy. Although this tragedy was far from fulfilling the high offices in the form of tone, characterisation and theme, Elizabethan theatre could not have existed without the ancient prototype. Most notably, this led to Shakespeare's production of tragedies such as Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra. The Shakespearean tragic heroes are typically overburdened and vulnerable to the threat of insanity. Like many of the early Greek tragedies, inward conflict and external pressure work together to push the tragic hero to the extremity of their nature, usually resulting in suicide. From Shakespeare's tragedies to the closing of the theatres in England by the Puritans in 1642, the quality of tragedy declined. The materials of tragedy, violence, madness, lust, soon lost their symbolic role in the Jacobean era and became perverted by their use in melodrama and sensationalism, mixed for relief with comedy. During the 19th century, however, the theme and spirit of tragedy can be found in the novel. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights seems to reflect the original concerns of tragedy, with its depiction of love and death, the consequences of human actions, malicious fate, and the pitiable tragic hero. The movement towards naturalism in fiction in the latter decades of the 19th century marked a new turn in the tragic novel. In Norway, Henrik Ibsen incorporated into his plays the narrow ambitiousness of his society. The hypocrisy of overburdening men and women replaced the higher powers of the old tragedy. His major tragic theme was the futility, leading to catastrophe, of the idealist effort to create a new and better social order. In summary, the tragedy has faced much change since 5th century Greece. One thing which has remained constant throughout its time is the tragic hero, whose actions always lead to detrimental and destructive consequences. Overall, these forms of tragedy reflect the original prototype of the Greek tragedy and are designed to purge the audience of their negative emotions, being used by playwrights to critique and express the dangers of society.